Hey, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa, nau mai, haere mai. Good evening. Thanks very much, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for your patience waiting for us to get underway. I'm David Capie. I'm the Director of the Centre for Strategic Studies here at Te Herenga-Waka, Victoria University of Wellington. And I'm also very proud to be a trustee of the Asia New Zealand Foundation. And it's my pleasure to welcome you along this evening to this international launch, presentation, world launch, global first. You are indeed a privileged group of the Southeast Asian Perceptions of New Zealand. So can I say thanks, first of all, very much to everyone coming along this evening. Can I acknowledge the honorary advisors of the Foundation who are in the audience and the diplomatic community. I noticed a number of regular friends of the Institute of International Affairs and also a good number of students. It's fantastic to see you here this evening. Now, I have to start with a confession, and that is that I am a tragic nerd and nothing excites me more than longitudinal research. And one of the great, I think, treasures and taonga that the Foundation produces each year is its annual survey of New Zealanders' perceptions of Asia and Asian people. That is now in its 28th year. And I think every year when that's released, it's a wonderful opportunity for us to reflect on our relationships with Asia, to think about New Zealanders' understanding of the region and what areas what are some of the challenges and what are some of the opportunities in our relationships with Asia. And as much as that excites me, I think I'm even more excited about tonight's publication that we're going to hear about, and that is because the Foundation has reversed the telescope, if you like, and that rather than, as well as doing its annual survey of what New Zealanders think about Asia, this time they have gone out into the region and asked what Southeast Asians think about New Zealand. And I think we're going to find some really interesting results from that survey this evening. So we know that from the Perceptions of Asia work, we know that New Zealanders are seeing Southeast Asia as increasingly important to our country's future. They're increasingly feeling warm towards the sub-region, with friend perceptions of Southeast Asian countries jumping quite notably in the most recent survey. And of course, the government has put a lot of emphasis on closer relations, a step up with Southeast Asia over the last couple of years. I think there's been something like 40 ministerial visits into the region. Of course, Prime Minister Luxon was just at the East Asia Summit and the ASEAN Summit, the commemorative 50th anniversary summit, and concluding a comprehensive strategic partnership with ASEAN just in the last couple of weeks. So it's really wonderful to have this chance to learn a little bit more about how we are seen in the region, partly because, if nothing else, it helps us tailor and think about those perceptions and how we can work on our tailoring our engagement more effectively, to think what our strengths are and what some of the areas are where we need to do more work. So without any further ado from me, just to let you know, this evening I'm delighted we will hear from, first of all, Dr. Julia Macdonald, the Foundation's Director of Research and Engagement, and she will present this work and talk about the findings. And then she'll do that for about 20 minutes or so. And we've got if you're wondering why the room is slightly darkened, it is, first of all, so you don't have to see me. And secondly, so you can see what I'm sure will be a really interesting slide deck from Julia. And then I'm also really pleased that we've got an all-star panel of discussants to offer some initial thoughts before we give you a chance to answer some questions. So we have with us tonight Kenneth Leong and Jason Young. And Kenneth is a Malaysian New Zealander based in Auckland. He's the director of Tiaki Capital, former director of the ASEAN New Zealand Business Council, chair of the ASEAN New Zealand Business Council. He's been a friend of the Foundation for many years, and we're very grateful that he's found time to come down from Auckland to share some thoughts about this research today. So Kenneth, a very warm welcome to you. And next to him is my esteemed colleague and friend from Victoria University, Dr. Associate Professor Jason Young. Jason is the Director of the New Zealand Contemporary China Research Centre and also an Associate Professor in International Relations here at Victoria. So Jason, a very warm welcome to you. Thanks for finding time on what I know has been a very busy day for you. There will be a chance after we've heard from our two discussants. We'll open up to the floor, so please think about your questions that you'd like to put to our panelists. But without any further ado from me, please could you give a warm welcome to Dr. Julia Macdonald.
Thanks, David. And thank you all so much for being here this evening. This is a piece of work that the Foundation has wanted to undertake for some time now. And so we're really thrilled to be able to share the findings of the report with you today. So as David said, I'm going to canter through a lot of slides, bombard you with some information. Hopefully it will keep you awake, even though you're in sort of slightly dim surroundings. And then we'll turn over to the panel to try and make sense of some of the findings that I present. So about the survey, as David has already foreshadowed, this really complements the Perceptions of Asia survey that we do every year, that we've done for 28 years, by turning the mirror back on ourselves to ask how New Zealand and its role in the region is viewed within Asia. This is based on sort of recognition that, to build on and to deepen our relationships in Asia, we not only need to understand more about Asia ourselves, but we also need to understand how our behavior, how our actions, our policies are viewed in the region itself, to be able to tailor our engagements, to be able to build stronger and deeper connections moving forward. So this specifically, and not only Southeast Asia, in 4 specific countries. So we're starting small, and there's hope to expand this work in the future. So it takes in the work of the views of 200 leading voices who are based in Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, and the Philippines. It is a small sample. It is 50 per country, so 200 in total. So this is really a group of people who we've screened for knowledge of New Zealand, who work in international affairs, and who have sense of sort of New Zealand's foreign policy already and our place in the region. So it is a different kind of survey to the Perceptions of Asia survey. This is not a general population poll. And so when I show you comparisons between the 2 sets of data, bear that in mind. That's more informative, but it isn't, we're not comparing apples to apples in these types of surveys. The respondents were aged between 31 and 70. 60% have been working in international affairs for at least 6 years. So they're somewhat seasoned international affairs professionals. And the survey was carried out in May of this year. So turning to some of the findings, and starting with New Zealand's reputation and media coverage. So in the Perceptions of Asia survey that we do, we often ask what is the first word that comes to mind when we say Asia. And in New Zealand, that's usually dominated by one big country, China, and things we like to do a lot, namely eat food. So food and China dominate the Perceptions of Asia findings for us. When it comes to the respondents in Southeast Asia, you can see that the response is quite different. New Zealand's clean green image comes across very dominantly in terms of first word associations. So nature, environment was listed by over 50% of the respondents. After that, you get mention of agriculture, wine, cuisine by about 14%. And after that, liberal politics, tourism, and a site for adventure activities by 9%. But nature and environment clearly dominate in terms of our the first word associations with New Zealand. A similar theme arises when you look at what stands out in terms of New Zealand's reputation. So nature, environment, climate, by 22% of respondents. The high quality of education, and this is a theme that you will see throughout the report, the importance of the education links that have been built in Southeast Asia by 21%, and particularly noted by the Indonesian and Malaysian respondents to the survey. And then third, the agriculture, livestock, dairy expertise that New Zealand is known for. We also ask in our own Perceptions of Asia research about what themes dominate New Zealand media in terms of Asia, and that's often political instability, conflict, bad news stories dominate a lot of our media. It's quite different when you look at what is covered on New Zealand in the respondent countries. So we have environment and climate related matters at the top again. Then you have diplomatic relations and official visits. And I think that's a testament to the high tempo of activity, the large number of ministerial visits that David mentioned that have been out in the region in Southeast Asia over the past 2 years. And then business, economic and trade developments. Just in terms of country differences. So Singapore mentioned technology and science a lot more. And Indonesia also point to arts, culture and entertainment stories as being important. Looking at our relationships and our bilateral relationships, we were interested in how aligned respondents in these countries saw themselves with New Zealand. And so we asked, how like-minded is New Zealand to your country on the following range of aspects? You can see that at the top, economic and trade interests is where the respondents see New Zealand and their countries as most aligned at 89%. And shared political or governance ideals falls to the bottom at 82%. But clearly economic trade at the top. Indonesia sees us as most aligned, as does the Philippines. They're in the 90th percentile. And Malaysia sees us overall as least aligned, usually in the 70th percentile, and they average out to the results you see in the table there. Friend and threat perceptions always gets a lot of attention when we release the Perceptions of Asia survey. And so we thought we'd ask how these countries see New Zealand in terms of friend and threat perceptions. And if they see us as a friend, which we hoped they would, how close a friend do they see us? You see Singapore at the top there feeling the warmest towards New Zealand at 92%. That matches our own results as seeing Singapore as our closest friend in Southeast Asia, also in the Perceptions of Asia research just to the right. Interestingly, Indonesia sees us as being a very close friend also, the next on the list at 86%. In our own research at the Foundation, we found that New Zealanders tend to know very little about Indonesia, and that actually drives relatively low friend sentiment and understanding in our own perceptions of Indonesia. So I think what this shows is that there's great opportunity there, right? There's very warm sentiment in Indonesia to build relationships, to deepen relationships with New Zealand. And then you have the Philippines and Malaysia following after. Now, we weren't only interested in the bilateral relationship and our relationships with these countries, we were also interested in who they thought New Zealand's best friend was in the region. And so you can see at the top, New Zealanders' views of our closest friends in Asia. At the bottom, you see Southeast Asian views of New Zealand's closest friends in Asia. And there's some similarities and some quite obvious differences. So Japan and Singapore are both ranked as the first and second by New Zealanders in terms of our views out to the region and by the Southeast Asian respondents as well. Interestingly, Singapore and Indonesia named themselves as New Zealand's closest friends in Asia. And Malaysia chose China as New Zealand's closest friend. And if you look at the data, that's driven by our close trade and economic ties. You'll also see in our own perceptions that the Philippines and South Korea rank much more highly. And that comes down to a difference in drivers of friend perceptions. And so when you look at the Southeast Asian respondents, they're placing or seeing friend perceptions as being driven by trade and economic ties, tourism, general feelings of positivity around the relationship. Whereas people-to-people links, migration, cultural similarities play a much greater role in the New Zealand perceptions, which is why you see the Philippines and South Korea ranked more highly. The good news is New Zealand is seen as a very trusted country in the region. So 86% of the respondents see New Zealand as being very trustworthy or trustworthy, and to acting responsibly in the world. So high results there. You see Indonesia quite significantly above average, 98%, and Malaysia a little under average, again, mirroring sort of that slightly less aligned view of Malaysian and New Zealand foreign policies. But overall, 86% is a very positive result in terms of how trustworthy and responsible New Zealand is. Similarly, New Zealand is seen to live up to its claims and promises at a very high percent. So 90% of respondents thought that New Zealand frequently or almost always lives up to its claims and promises. So a sense that New Zealand is really walking the walk in terms of what it promises and then delivers in the policy space. And there's a little bit of variation. You see Indonesia, again, is very positive. Philippines, slightly less so, but overall, 90% a very strong result. And part of the motivation for this research is obviously to understand how we can build stronger relationships, deeper relationships with our Southeast Asian partners. And to understand how we do that, we also need to understand the barriers to date in terms of growing bilateral relations. And so we asked, what are the biggest barriers to stronger relations with your country? A lack of knowledge and understanding about one another ranks top, followed by a lack of not a lack of, but historic, cultural and linguistic differences. This is interesting from my perspective, because when I look at the Perceptions of Asia results over the past 2 years, what you see is actually a decline in interest in New Zealanders wanting to learn about the history, the culture, the religion of countries in Asia. And you're also seeing a decline in interest in learning languages, as well as a decline in opportunities to learn languages. And so this points to the importance of continuing to invest in those skills and continuing to invest in understanding and language to be able to communicate effectively. Just as an additional country difference, Indonesia pointed to New Zealand's immigration policies and systems being very difficult. So they highlighted that much more highly. And I think it's just good news in general that the perception that New Zealand isn't important, which, one might think, given our geographic place in the world, is very low on that list relative to these other factors. In terms of areas for increased cooperation and where we could do more together, education and knowledge transfer is top at 38%. Education is, again, as I said, a common theme throughout the findings in terms of our strength of relationships in the region. Trade and business, and then tourism. Those are the top 3 ranked by the Philippines, Malaysia, and Indonesia. Singapore is slightly different. Singapore wants to see more on tourism, but also climate change and environment, and science, technology, and innovation, reflecting its sort of position as an advanced economy, but also a smaller economy that needs to focus on food security, supply chains, and other technological advances. Perceptions of New Zealand's foreign policy. We were very curious to know what people thought the key drivers were of New Zealand's foreign policy and what was shaping the decisions that they see. Principles and values comes up as number 1, 29%, and important, especially for Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Philippines. That's followed by trade and economic interests. And third, maintaining relationships with traditional partners. Now, you'll see Singapore as a slight outlier here in terms of the results. For Singapore, maintaining relationships with traditional security partners is seen as one of the main drivers of New Zealand's foreign policy. That's followed by trade and economic interests and security interests and regional stability. So I'll be curious to see what the panelists thought of that result. But it may be part of our relationship with Singapore, what we focus on in our areas of cooperation. It may also be how Singapore sees foreign policy generated in its own context, and you see that reflected in the results here. So I think we'll dig a little deeper on that in the discussion. 87% of 87% of respondents to the survey think that New Zealand upholds its independent foreign policy frequently or almost always. So it's seen as a pretty independent voice in international affairs. Indonesia thinks so more than average. And the country that thinks that this is slightly under the average in terms of that 87% is Singapore. And that obviously correlates a little bit with Singapore saying also that our foreign policy might be shaped more by our relationships with traditional security partners than the other respondents. Now, a lot of the discussion, I think, at least in Wellington, around the government's activities in Asia has been focused a lot around trade, right? Sort of uplifting trade, doubling exports and so forth. And so we thought it would be interesting to know how that discourse is being perceived in Southeast Asia. Is that how we're being received as being too focused on trade relative to other aspects of our relationship? The results are quite interesting. So you'll see at 57% actually think New Zealand could increase its focus on trade. 37% overall think New Zealand strikes a good balance in its relationship. But you'll see across the board, Indonesia, Singapore, Malaysia, the majority of respondents think that New Zealand could increase its focus on trade. Only the Philippines thinks that New Zealand strikes overall a good balance. And very few think that there's too much emphasis on trade in New Zealand's bilateral relations with their countries. And then finally, in this section, we asked what issues New Zealand should take a stronger stance on. And again, you see the view that New Zealand is well positioned and should be taking a stronger stance on environment and climate issues. That's followed by international peace and security. And the responses to that were based on countries' own interests. So we saw the Philippines talking about South China Sea issues, for example. And then third, trade and economy, mention of New Zealand supporting a multilateral system, an open, free and fair trading regime, and so forth. But clearly New Zealand's seen as being a leader should be being a leader on climate, and then international peace and security following that. So the final section looks at global challenges, defense and development cooperation. We ask in the Perceptions of Asia survey what New Zealanders are most concerned about. And so we thought we would ask on Southeast Asian respondents what they think New Zealand should be most worried about. You'll see climate change and environmental problems are top, followed by a global economic downturn, reflecting an understanding that New Zealand is a small country, trade dependent, and the world is increasingly protectionist. After that, the results were very split, and so no clear standouts beyond those two, which came across much more strongly. You can compare that briefly to the results of the Perceptions of Asia survey in terms of what New Zealanders are worried about. So climate change and environmental problems are also very high for New Zealand at 47%, but you'll see fake news and misinformation, cyber attacks, the rise of authoritarian systems, right-wing extremism ranking much more highly for New Zealanders than they did for the Southeast Asian respondents. Looking to top priorities for security and defense cooperation moving forwards, nearly all of the 4 country respondents highlighted the importance of natural disasters and climate change as a key area for cooperation in defense and security. Only the Philippines put maritime security higher, but maritime security was also seen as important by Malaysia, Singapore, and Indonesia. And then conflict prevention and peacekeeping also highlighted, especially by Singapore. But lots of scope there and interest in increased cooperation, especially in those 3 areas. And then the final slide, I'm done bombarding you with pretty pictures, is looking at where New Zealand's aid and development has the most impact. Again, education, 52%. And in fact, for Malaysians, 74% put education in their top 3. So clearly the results of, Colombo Plan, Menaki scholarships, all of the effort and aid that has gone into building education links still coming through very strongly in this survey. That's followed by climate change and then agriculture, and where Singapore was quite strong on sort of agriculture connections and programs having impact. So what does this mean overall? And I'm sure the panelists will shed light on that as well. We clearly enjoy an excellent reputation that comes through very strongly among those in Southeast Asia with this knowledge of New Zealand foreign policy, noting, of course, that this is a small sample, an informed but small sample. New Zealand is seen as upholding its independent foreign policy, which is seen as being driven primarily by principles and values, though noting that Singapore sees it being driven by traditional security partnerships. And we are trusted to act responsibly in the world at a very high level. There's a call among the respondents in the survey for New Zealand to take a stronger stance on global issues. That includes climate change, but also maritime security, free and open trading system. And climate change seen also as the issue that we should be most worried about. The lack of knowledge and understanding is identified as a key barrier to closer relations, combined with the linguistic and cultural differences. So a real call for continued investment in those skills and those capabilities. And as always, there is appetite to further trade and business opportunities, to scale up education, climate change assistance, and to cooperate more on defense and security issues, especially in those areas that I identified. So I think with that, I will end the PowerPoint. Maybe I will turn up the lights so you can all see again.